Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment. Not a long moment, just a breath. Picture something that cannot be broken. Something that was never meant to break. A being that stands 2.5 meters tall, wrapped in ceramite forged from the bones of dead stars, carrying weapons that can split tanks in half and reduce infantry platoons to smoke and vapor, in the time it takes an ordinary soldier to register that contact has been made. A being that heals faster than most men bleed, that has not one heart, but two, redundant biological systems that make even catastrophic chest trauma survivable if the medics reach him in time. A being that cannot be made to feel nausea or dizziness or motion sickness, that can drink poison and metabolize it into something useful, that can eat glass and process it without injury, that can hold its breath for minutes at a time, that can enter a half sleep with one hemisphere of its brain while the other remains alert and watchful. This being has 19 surgically implanted organs, each serving a specific purpose in the transformation from mortal human to something that occupies the same general category as human beings, the way a hawk occupies the same general category as a chicken. The os modular reshapes the skeleton, thickening and reinforcing bone until it can turn a bullet. The hemastomen changes the blood chemistry so that clotting occurs with extraordinary speed. The Betcher's gland allows the production of a corrosive acid in the saliva, which is exactly as unsettling as it sounds. The melochromic organ adjusts the skin's response to radiation, and the black carapace, at the last and most invasive of all the implants, merges with the nervous system to allow the warrior to interface directly with his power armor, as if the armor were a second body, a second skin made of ceramite and servos. On top of all of this, the training, years, sometimes a decade or more, of relentless, systematized brutality that would break most ordinary people in the first weeks. The psychological conditioning that runs alongside the physical transformation, the hypno-indoctrination that reshapes specific mental pathways, that rewires the response to fear and pain, that builds loyalty into the architecture of the mind rather than asking for it as a choice. This is a space marine, an Adeptus Astartes, the Angels of Death, humanity's sharpest weapon and its most sacred institution. 1,000 chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors each, deployed across a galaxy containing hundreds of billions of souls, in a war that has been ongoing for 10,000 years and shows no signs of ending, and according to the oldest and most enduring piece of their mythology, codified in the very words the Emperor himself supposedly spoke when he built them, words that appear on the first page of every major codex entry, that are carved into the stone of fortress monasteries, that are repeated in the liturgies recited before every engagement. They know no fear. They shall know no fear. Not they are brave, which would acknowledge a struggle. Not they feel fear, but push through it, which would acknowledge a human interior. They shall know no fear. As if fear itself is a language they were never taught to speak, and a frequency they were designed to never receive. But here is the thing about that phrase, and it is something the lore has quietly confirmed in 1,000 different ways across decades of novels and codexes, and supplemental material and battlefield accounts that stretch from the founding of the legions in the 30th millennium all the way to the fractured present of the era Indomitus. It is not entirely true, and the gap between the myth and the reality, between what the Space Marines say about themselves and what they actually experience when they lie still in the dark hours before a battle, when they watch a brother fall to something they could not prevent, when they look across a battlefield and recognize, with a cold certainty, they were not expecting, and that the enemy they face is using tactics that could only have been learned from a brother. That gap is one of the most quietly fascinating threads running through the whole of the 41st millennium. The story of what Space Marines actually fear is, in the end, the story of what they actually are. Not what the Imperium needs them to be, not what the conditioning was designed to make them, but what survived the Forge. What came out of the other side of 10 years of training and 19 surgeries and decades of war? What persisted in the deep chambers of the transhuman mind when everything that could be removed had been removed? And it turns out that what remains, when you strip away the ordinary fears, the fear of pain, the fear of darkness, the fear of being alone, as the animal fear of being eaten, is something far more interesting than simple cowardice could ever be. What remains reveals what Space Marines actually value, what they actually care about, with the portion of their consciousness that was never fully conditioned away. What they actually understand, at the deepest level, would constitute a loss irreversible enough to matter. So settle in. Let this breathe. We are going to walk through the catalogue of things that keep even the angels of death watchful when the shooting stops. We are going to sit with the fears they would never fully acknowledge, the fears that are written into their genetic code, the fears that entire philosophical traditions within the chapters have been constructed to suppress, and the fears that specific types of enemies were seemingly designed by evolution or divine malice or sheer cosmic indifference to exploit. Some of what we find will be familiar, some of it will be strange, and some of it, if you let yourself sit with it properly, will be surprisingly human. The myth of no fear, what the training actually does, and what it leaves behind. Before we can talk about what Space Marines fear, we need to spend some careful time with what they do not fear, and more importantly, the process that created that absence, because understanding what was done to them tells us everything about what could not be done, what resisted the process, what survived intact when the transformation was complete. When a young man is selected to become a Space Marine aspirant, typically somewhere between 10 and 14 years of age, drawn from the warrior cultures that the Adeptus Astartes have identified as producing the most suitable candidates, he brings with him all the ordinary fears that any adolescent would carry. Fear of pain, fear of failure, fear of shame in front of his peers, perhaps a specific fear of the dark, or of heights, or of confined spaces, or of whatever particular thing his individual childhood produced in him. The basic biological inheritance of a species that spent its evolutionary prehistory trying very hard not to be eaten, that developed fear as a survival mechanism over hundreds of thousands of years of being genuinely at the bottom of many food chains before it developed enough cleverness to start moving up. The transformation process does not simply add muscle and bone and organs to this boy. It reaches into the architecture of his mind with something that the official records describe as psycho-conditioning, and begins a systematic process of rearranging what it finds there. The hypno-conditioning is not gentle. It is not encouragement or positive reinforcement in any conventional sense. The aspirant is subjected to hypnotherapy, to the implantation of specific commands and responses at a level below conscious thought, to a sustained and methodical process of rewriting specific neural pathways while leaving others intact. The Lexicanum describes the result as conditioning that strengthens resolve and hones the recruit into a dedicated and merciless warrior. What this means, in more granular terms, is that the part of the aspirant's brain that generates panic, the ancient mammalian alarm system that says danger is here, move now, move away, is not simply silenced. It is redirected. The signal is still generated, but instead of producing the impulse to flee, it now produces the impulse to engage. Think about what this means practically. An ordinary human being, faced with something terrifying, let us say a 14-meter war beast bearing down on them, experiences a cascade of physiological responses. Heart rate spikes, pupils dilate, blood flows to the major muscle groups in preparation for either explosive movement or explosive combat. The conscious mind receives a very loud message from the body, and that message says something like, "Please do not be here right now." Most people, faced with the 14-meter war beast, receive this message and evaluate it as worth listening to. A Space Marine receives what is functionally the same initial signal. The body still registers the threat, still produces the chemical cascade. and the output of the system is different. Where the ordinary human's body says leave, the Space Marine's conditioning-modified neural architecture says engage. The instinct that was shaped by 10 million years of evolution to protect the individual organism has been repurposed to serve the chapter and the emperor instead. The fear response has been turned inside out. This creates a being who is, in the conventional sense, genuinely fearless in the face of physical danger. Not because they cannot recognize danger, they recognize it with extraordinary sophistication. Since the training that accompanied the conditioning has given them a tactical awareness that makes most soldiers seem nearly blind by comparison. But because the recognition of danger does not produce the response in them that it would produce in anyone else. They are not brave in the way that an ordinary human soldier is brave, through the act of choosing to act despite feeling afraid. They simply do not experience the afraid part in the same way. Denny Flowers, one of the authors who has written for Black Library, described the psychology of Space Marines with unusual honesty. They not only do not feel our emotions, but barely understand them outside of a wartime situation. No fear is a cool trait for a soldier, but utterly alien to most higher life forms. It is a trait closer to insects and other hive creatures, where self-preservation takes a back seat to the needs of the collective. But here is where it gets interesting, and this is where the law has spent considerable time. The conditioning removes specific things, the fear of physical threat to the self, the flight response, the instinct towards self-preservation at the expense of mission. But it does not, and perhaps cannot, remove everything. The Space Marine still has values, still has things he cares about with genuine intensity, still has what might be called, in a sufficiently broad definition, emotional responses to the world around him. He experiences something like pride when he or his brothers distinguish themselves. He experiences something like grief when warriors he has served beside for decades fall in combat. He experiences something that Black Library authors have described as love, not romantic love, typically, since that aspect of human experience seems to be one of the things most thoroughly altered by the conditioning. But the particular fierce attachment that comes from having trusted your life to someone and had them trust theirs to you, over and over, across years and decades and campaigns on a dozen worlds. And most importantly for our purposes today, he experiences something like fear, when the thing at risk is not his physical safety, but something that the conditioning explicitly did not address. When the thing at risk is not the body, but the meaning, not the life, but the mission, not the individual, but the chapter, the gene seed, the lineage, the institution that gives his existence its context and its purpose. Another author writing for the universe, Jude Reed, put it this way: "For me, the most interesting thing about Space Marines is that they are totally inhuman. The most interesting stories drill into what it would be like to have become something post-human, and how it would change you and your outlook on the world. The fears that remain are the fears of something post-human, not the fears of a human in a strong body, but the fears of a genuinely different kind of mind that happens to have emerged from a human origin. And they are strange fears, alien fears in some respects, but also profoundly revealing ones. Let us begin with the oldest and the deepest, the one that sits in every Space Marine chest like a coal that never quite goes out. At the corruption of self, the fear that was never supposed to exist. There is a reason that chaplains exist as a distinct and essential officer class within Space Marine chapters. Not just as warriors who know the litanies, not just as figures who lead the prayers before battle and attend the dead after it, but as something more specific and more unusual. What amounts to a permanent psychological oversight function, dedicated to monitoring the interior lives of warriors who were supposedly conditioned to not need monitoring. The fact that this function is considered necessary tells you a great deal. The fear of corruption by chaos is the most spiritually profound fear a Space Marine carries, and it is the one that the culture is most actively organized to manage and suppress. Because it is not a fear that can simply be trained away. It is, in a sense, the inevitable consequence of everything that makes a space marine formidable. To understand why, you need to understand what chaos actually is, at the metaphysical level, rather than just the military one. The chaos gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, are not simply powerful entities who chose to be evil in the way a villain in a story chooses it. They are, according to the foundational metaphysics of the 41st millennium, the personifications of the deepest aspects of mortal consciousness. They are what mortal minds produce when they think and feel and suffer and desire with enough collective intensity over enough time. Khorne is the rage and violence that every conscious being is capable of, crystallized and deified. Slaanesh is the hunger for sensation and the compulsion toward excess. And Nurgle is the despair that comes with decay, the strange comfort of accepting that everything falls apart. Tzeentch is the ambition that overreaches, the desire for forbidden knowledge, the intoxication of manipulation. These things exist in every conscious being, in varying proportions, managed with varying degrees of success. In an ordinary human, they exist in ordinary human quantities, and the management required is ordinary human management. In a space marine, who was designed to feel everything more intensely, to be driven by purpose and loyalty, and the particular fury of combat with a force that ordinary humans do not approach. In a space marine, these qualities exist in vastly amplified forms. The pride of a space marine is not the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman. It is the bone-deep certainty of a being who has survived things that should not be survivable, who has dedicated his entire existence to a cause that consumes everything else, who carries on his armor and in his memory the accumulated record of deeds that would make ordinary soldiers sound like myths. This pride is real and functional and serves him well in most contexts. It is also precisely the kind of material that Tzeentch and Slaanesh find most interesting. The fury that space marines bring to close combat is not anger in the ordinary sense. It is something closer to a force of nature, shaped by years of training and conditioning into a directed thing, a weapon in itself. But weapons that are pointed can sometimes be turned, and the fury that drives a space marine through a defensive line can also, as under specific pressures, applied in specific ways, be turned against the things that were never supposed to be targets. The corruption process does not announce itself. It does not come like an enemy assault, loudly and with obvious malice, in a form that the combat training can recognize and respond to. It comes quietly, along hairline cracks in the conditioning, through small choices that seem righteous at the time, that are motivated by genuine grievances or genuine virtues or genuine devotion to the wrong thing. The Horus Heresy, which remains, 10,000 years later, the defining catastrophic event in space marine culture, the wound that the entire institutional structure of the Adeptus Astartes was reorganized to prevent from ever happening again, was not caused by simple treachery in the sense of a villain deciding to be a villain. The Primarchs who fell, and in falling took their entire legions with them, fell because their specific virtues were the specific vulnerabilities that the ruinous powers had identified and cultivated. Horus fell, and the lore has spent considerable pages exploring exactly how, through a vision in a temple on a moon called Davin, through wounds made by a tainted blade that let something dark inside him while his consciousness was separated from his body, through the accumulated weight of feeling passed over by a father who had moved on to his next project and left his finest son to run the war alone. And Horus was arguably the greatest general in human history. He was certainly the most trusted of the Emperor's sons. His fall was not the fall of a weakling. It was the fall of something magnificent, bent beyond its tolerance by pressures that were specifically calibrated to find the places where even magnificent things bend. Lorgar fell because his genuine spiritual longing had nowhere legitimate to go. He believed in the divine with his whole being, and when the Emperor told him the divine did not exist and humiliated the word-bearers publicly for their devotion, the Chaos Gods were waiting with open arms and a different answer. Fulgrim fell because his dedication to perfection, genuinely admirable in its origins, was cultivated past the point of self-control into the obsession that Slaanesh was specifically designed to harvest. Angron did not so much fall as he was already falling when the Emperor found him, the butcher's nails in his skull having replaced most of what would have made voluntary loyalty possible. None of these were weak men. They were the most formidable beings of their age. The lesson that every subsequent Space Marine and every chaplain and every Inquisitor took from their falls is the precise opposite of reassuring. If it could happen to them, it can happen to anyone. This is why the rituals of purification exist, why the rites of redemption are performed, why chaplains walk the lines not just before battle, but after it, in the quieter periods between campaigns, listening carefully for the particular silence that suggests something is being held back, not shared, nursed in private. That the entire system of spiritual monitoring that runs through Space Marine culture is the institutionalized acknowledgement of this fear, the acknowledgement that corruption is not something that only happens to the weak, and that the only protection against it is constant, active, never-resting vigilance. What makes this fear distinctively Space Marine, as opposed to the fear of corruption that any devout person might feel, is the specific character of what corrupted Space Marines become. The Chaos Space Marine is not simply a warrior who made bad choices. He is a mirror. Every time a loyalist Astartes faces a warrior in the 8-pointed star, he is looking at the endpoint of a journey that began somewhere that looked, from the outside, exactly like where he stands now. Same augmentations, same training methodology, same architectural plan. The specific knowledge of tactics and weak points and psychological vulnerabilities that a Chaos Space Marine brings to any engagement against his loyalist counterparts, that knowledge was learned in the same schools that produced the warriors facing him. The traitor legions fight with particular ferocity against their former brothers, not just because of ideology or demonic compulsion, but because they understand the enemy completely. They were the enemy once. And what they have become in 10,000 years of fighting in the Eye of Terror, under the patronage of powers that reward success with mutation and damnation in equal measure, is a warning and a temptation simultaneously. A warning of what lies at the end of a certain road. A temptation because the road offers, at least initially, things that are genuinely appealing. Power beyond what loyalty currently provides. Freedom from the constraints of the Codex Astartes. The specific satisfaction of following one's own path, rather than the path prescribed by a dead man's military treatise. The chaplain's skull face, repeated across every chapter that maintains the Reclusium tradition, is a deliberate aesthetic choice that communicates something about this specific fear. The skulls says that death is inevitable, that the warrior before him knows this, and that the question is not whether death will come, but whether the death will mean something. Whether the warrior will fall in a way that honors everything he was made to be, or whether he will fall in the other sense, before the death of the body, the death of the loyalty that made the body worth preserving. And the fact that this reminder requires such an elaborate institutional structure to maintain, that it cannot simply be installed once and left alone, but requires constant renewal and monitoring and active management, tells you everything about how seriously Space Marine culture takes the threat. You do not build watchtowers on peaceful borders. Gene seed failure, the death that outlasts the warrior. There is an argument to be made that the fear of corruption is the most spiritually profound fear a Space Marine carries. But there is a different fear that might be more immediately existential, not for the individual warrior, but for the collective that gives the individual warrior his context. And in a culture where the collective is everything, where the chapter is the primary unit of identity and the primary object of loyalty, or threats to the collective cut differently than threats to the self. The fear of gene seed failure is the chapter's fear, and it is one that runs constantly, at a low but never zero level, through every apothecary's assessment, and every wolf priest's monitoring, and every sanguinary priest's careful observation of his brothers. Let us start from the beginning. The gene seed, the viral and genetic machinery that makes the transformation from mortal human to space marine possible, is not a simple thing. It is 19 different organ-growing programs, each designed to produce one of the 19 organs that make an Astartes what he is. The os medulla grows from a small implant into a full hormonal system that restructures the skeleton. The biscopea enhances musculature beyond anything the natural human body could achieve. Then the hemastamen rewires the blood. The Larraman's organ creates specialized cells that seal wounds in seconds, and so on, through the full catalogue of alterations that take a boy and return something that technically belongs to the same species, but inhabits that category, the way a deep-sea predator inhabits the ocean. Each of these 19 processes depends on genetic programming that was originally crafted in the Emperor's laboratories on Terra in the 30th millennium, using the genomes of his 20 primarchs as templates. The primarchs were themselves extraordinary beings, genetically engineered by the Emperor, using his own genome as a starting point, then further developed in ways that current imperial science cannot fully replicate or even fully understand. Their genetic material formed the foundation from which each legion's gene seed was derived, which is why the Space Wolves fight and think and feel the way they do. Their gene seed carries the imprint of Leman Russ, a Primarch who was himself shaped by Fenris in ways that nobody fully predicted, which is why the Blood Angels carry beauty and blood hunger in equal measure. Sanguinius's genome contained both, and both were transmitted. The problem is that genetic material is not static. It changes over time. It drifts from its template under the accumulated pressure of use, of combat, of exposure to the various forms of energetic and psychic assault that the 41st millennium delivers in abundance. Warp energies in particular can alter gene seed in ways that range from cosmetically interesting to functionally catastrophic. Radiation can damage the progenoid glands, the specific organs that store and propagate the gene seed, rendering them useless. And corrupted gene seed leads to corrupted space marines, in the genetic rather than spiritual sense. Warriors whose implants do not function as intended, who develop characteristics their chapter was not designed to have, whose bodies express something that was never part of the original plan and may not be compatible with continued service. Each chapter is required by Adeptus Mechanicus mandate to tithe 5% of its gene seed to Mars on a regular basis. This serves two purposes. The first is monitoring. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains constant surveillance of every chapter's genetic health, watching for signs of drift and mutation and degradation. As the second is backup. Mars holds archived samples of every major chapter's gene seed, allowing for reconstruction if a catastrophic loss occurs in the field. But the monitoring has limits. The archival process has gaps, and history has provided more than enough examples of what happens when gene seed corruption progresses past the point where monitoring catches it in time. The 21st founding of Space Marine chapters, which became known as the Cursed Founding, is the most devastating large-scale example. Something went wrong with the gene seed used to establish this batch of new chapters. Not the same thing in every case. Different corruptions, different expressions, different consequences. But chapter after chapter from this founding exhibited unusual and often dangerous genetic characteristics, and some of which had no clear origin in the founding Primarch's genome. Many of these chapters have fought with unusual difficulty ever since, their effectiveness limited by physical or psychological traits that were never intended. Some came close to extinction. A few may have achieved it in ways that were never officially recorded. The apothecary's role is not simply to provide battlefield medicine, though that is certainly part of it. The deeper function, the one that the chapter would prioritize, even at the cost of the apothecary's own life, is the recovery of progenoid glands from fallen warriors. These glands, 2 per space marine, 1 in the neck and 1 in the chest, are the chapter's biological future. They contain the mature gene seed that can be extracted, cultured, and eventually used to create the next generation of warriors. A warrior who falls in battle and whose progenoid glands are successfully recovered has given the chapter 2 new potential warriors. A warrior whose glands are lost, consumed by tyrannids, destroyed in an explosion, simply unrecoverable because the battle left no time for retrieval, has left a gap in the chapter's future that will take years to partially fill. This is why the apothecary's white armor marks him as someone of particular importance, why other warriors will fight specifically to protect the apothecary's ability to reach the fallen, why accounts of Space Marine battles are full of moments where the medical officer rushes through firefights not to save the wounded warrior's life. That may be impossible, but to recover what the warrior's body is carrying that has value beyond the warrior himself. The chain of loss, when it compounds, is catastrophic. A chapter that loses too many warriors in too short a time without recovering enough gene seed may find itself unable to replace those losses at the rate needed to maintain effectiveness. It may be able to function for a while on reduced numbers, but a chapter below strength is a chapter that cannot be everywhere it is needed, cannot respond to every threat it might once have handled. And a chapter that continues to take losses without replacement eventually ceases to be a chapter in any meaningful sense and becomes a historical record. The scythes of the Emperor came to this precipice, nearly destroyed by hive fleet kraken, reduced to such small numbers that the question before the surviving leadership was not how to win, but whether to fight on at all, or to accept that the chapter's end had come, and to die in whatever blaze of glory was available. The debate among the veterans, between those who wanted to end it properly, in combat, with honor, and those who accepted that survival and rebuilding was its own form of duty, reflected two different understandings of what a chapter is. Is a chapter the warriors in it at any given moment, in which case dying with them is the right response? Or is it the gene seed and the tradition and the mission, in which case preserving those things even at the cost of personal dignity is the right response? The scythes chose to rebuild. They received Primaris reinforcements during the Indomitus Crusade and continue to serve. But the debate they had, at the moment when the question was immediate and real, is a debate that runs through the institutional memory of every chapter that has ever come close to that edge. The gene seed is the chapter's immortality. It is the form in which the dead live on, in which the traditions of centuries are transmitted to warriors who were not yet born when those traditions were established, in which the genetic gifts of a Primarch who has been gone for 10,000 years continue to shape every warrior who wears the chapter's colors. The loss of it is not like losing a battle. It is like losing everything that gave the battle its meaning. The blood angels and the flaw, terror that lives in the blood. Of all the fears encoded in Space Marine genetics, none has been written about more thoroughly, none explored more poignantly in the literature and lore of the Warhammer universe, and none carries quite the specific weight of the blood angel's flaw. It is a fear that is also a curse, a psychological burden that every son of Sanguinius carries from the moment of their transformation, which grows heavier, not lighter with each passing year, and which has shaped everything about the chapter's culture, from its art to its funeral rites to the specific way its warriors choose to die. To understand the flaw, you need to understand Sanguinius, even briefly. He was the Primarch of the 9th Legion, possibly the most physically beautiful of all the Emperor's sons, a being of extraordinary physical grace who carried himself with a quality that made other Primarchs, themselves superhuman by any measure, seem somehow lesser by comparison. He had vast golden wings. On he moved through the world with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who has never questioned whether they belong in the room they are standing in. He was also, of all the Primarchs, one of the most spiritually perceptive. He carried genuine prophetic gifts, saw futures in dreams with a clarity that other psychers could not approach, and bore this foreknowledge with a quiet grief that never quite left his eyes. He knew, apparently for years before the event, approximately how he was going to die. He died on the Vengeful Spirit, the flagship of Horus, during the final stages of the Siege of Terra. He went there knowing, or strongly suspecting, what he would find. He died fighting the War Master, the man who had been his brother and his Emperor's most beloved son, and who had become something that used the War Master's body as a vehicle for forces that had no interest in brotherhood or love. He died torn apart. He died in agony, and the manner and the moment and the psychic scream of a Primarch's death left something in the warp and in the gene seed of his sons that 10,000 years of subsequent effort has not been able to remove. Something that will not go away. Every blood angel carries it. Not as a metaphor, not as a cultural tradition that they observe respectfully from a safe distance, but as an actual encoded experience. A psychic imprint left by Sanguinius's final moments that presses against the surface of every warrior's consciousness with a pressure that increases, year by year, with the age of the warrior who carries it. When aspirants first receive the gene seed of Sanguinius, the imprint is faint, barely perceptible, a distant whisper that the young warrior might not even recognize as something external to himself. By the time a blood angel has served for a century, the whisper has become a voice. By the time he has served for 5 centuries, the voice speaks with the vividness of genuine memory. The red thirst is the first way this manifests. It is the more manageable of the two, in the way that a persistent fever is more manageable than sepsis. All blood angels experience it. It is a bloodlust, a specific, targeted craving, not for violence in general, but for blood in particular, for the act of opening an enemy and touching what is inside them in the most intimate and terrible way that battle permits. This craving intensifies in the heat of combat in ways that can become overwhelming. Warriors have abandoned tactically sound positions to charge into close combat because the thirst demanded it. Squads have broken formations because the scent of spilled blood overrode the commands coming through the vox. The sanguinary priests, the blood angels equivalent of apothecaries with an additional spiritual dimension to their role, work constantly to manage this, both through rituals that provide a controlled expression of the craving and through their physical presence on the battlefield, serving as anchors of relative calm that keep warriors on the correct side of the line between controlled ferocity and consuming madness. But the red thirst, terrible as it is, pales beside the black rage. The black rage is what happens when the psychic memory of Sanguinius's death breaks through the barrier between the individual warrior's consciousness and the genetic experience encoded in his cells. When a blood angel is overcome by the black rage, it can happen before a battle, triggered by something in the approaching emotional intensity of armed conflict, or in the middle of an engagement, triggered by a specific sensory cue that no outside observer would be able to identify. His mind is not simply destabilized. It is replaced. He is no longer on whatever battlefield his body occupies in the physical present. He is in the final minutes of Sanguinius's life, experiencing the Primarch's dying agony as if it were his own, seeing the enemies around him as the forces of chaos that tore his father apart, unable to distinguish his battle brothers from the traitors he is reliving fighting against. The condition is irreversible. A warrior who has fallen fully to the black rage does not recover. What he has become, a creature of pure rage and grief, seeing the last battle of a being who died 10,000 years ago as an eternal present, is all he will ever be again. Rather than face a slow and undignified disintegration, the chapter forms those who have newly fallen to the rage into a unit called the Death Company. Their armor is painted black, daubed with red crosses marking the wounds Sanguinius received in his final moments. They are given the most dangerous assaults the chapter faces, the kind where the probability of survival is so low that the outcome is essentially predetermined. They die fighting, which is considered the only remaining form of honor available to them. There is a ceremony before the Death Company goes out. The chaplains speak words over them. The other warriors of the chapter watch and know what they are watching. They are watching brothers who were lost before the battle that will end them. They are watching what might await any one of them, given enough time. Now stay with that image for a moment. Every blood angel who has not fallen to the rage, which is to say, every blood angel currently serving, is living in the full awareness that this is probably where he is going. Not immediately, perhaps not for decades or centuries yet. But the older a blood angel is, the more frequently the visions come, the more vivid they are, and the harder they are to keep behind the wall that all the chapter's rituals and the chaplain's vigilance and the warrior's own iron will are collectively holding up. Commander Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels, is by most accounts more than 1,000 years old, the longest-lived loyalist space marine currently active in the Adeptus Astartes, in a position that essentially requires him to send brothers to the Death Company on a regular basis, knowing that the same fate is theoretically waiting for him. What keeps him going is not the absence of this fear. The fear, in him, must be larger than in almost any other living Astartes, given the length of time he has spent carrying the knowledge of what waits for him. What keeps him going is the specific and fierce decision to serve as completely as possible in whatever time remains before the rage takes him, to spend every year of remaining clarity in defense of the chapter and the Imperium. That is a different relationship with fear than the simple absence of it. And here is the detail that the lore returns to again and again, the one that makes the Blood Angel's specific terror so much more layered than simple victimhood. The flaw is not entirely separate from what makes the Blood Angels remarkable. Their extraordinary longevity. Some Blood Angels live for centuries longer than equivalent warriors of other chapters, comes from the same genetic peculiarity that carries the flaw. Their intense, almost overwhelming aesthetic sensitivity, as the way they pursue beauty in everything from combat to architecture to the art they make in their hours away from the front lines, is inseparable from the particular character of a consciousness shaped by the knowledge of approaching doom. Their legendary ferocity in close combat, which has driven tactical decisions across 10,000 years of warfare, draws from the same genetic source as the red thirst. The fear and the gift come from the same place. You cannot remove one without the other. Belisarius Cawl, who created the Primaris Space Marines and had every opportunity to excise the flaw from the Blood Angels' genetic inheritance when he was working with their gene seed, apparently decided not to. The lore suggests he believed the Emperor had placed the flaw there deliberately. Whether that interpretation is correct, or whether it is a convenient rationalization for a decision that was too complex to make otherwise, the effect is the same. The Blood Angels will carry this into whatever future the 41st Millennium offers, and every son of Sanguinius will live and die with it. One figure stands against the tide as something like hope, though hope qualified and made strange by the strangeness of what he endured. Mephiston, the Lord of Death, fell to the Black Rage and survived, the only Blood Angel known to have done so. He returned from it more powerful than before, his psychic gifts vastly amplified, his presence on the battlefield a force that veteran warriors of other chapters find difficult to look at directly. He is celebrated. He is also regarded within his own chapter, with a particular and understandable wariness, because no one can fully account for what he brought back with him from wherever he went, or what he left behind. The chapter looks at Mephiston the way you look at someone who returned from a place that returns are not supposed to be possible from. Glad they made it back, not entirely certain that who came back is the same person who went in. The space wolves and the curse of the wolfen. The animal at the door.
Okay, I want to stop here for just a second because it's actually the part of Space Marine lore that got me. I came in expecting these guys just to be cool super soldiers, big armor, loud guns, no fear, straightforward power fantasy, right? But the more I read, the more I realized the writers were doing something much more interesting. They were writing characters who had everything ordinary human fear stripped out of them, and then asking, what's left? What do you get when you remove the self-preservation instinct, and all that's standing is the things someone actually values? And the answer was just surprisingly moving, honestly, because what's left is real. Brotherhood. Legacy. The terror of becoming something unworthy of the sacrifice that made you. That's not nothing. That's arguably more human than the fears that got removed. For me, that's why 40K hits differently than a lot of other sci-fis. It's not really about the guns or the monsters, as cool as all of that is. It's about what it costs to be the thing that stands between humanity and extinction. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's go back to the video.
The Blood Angel's fear is the fear of a mind consumed by grief and memory, the Primarch's death playing on an eternal loop until there is no room left for anything else. The Space Wolf's fear is its own kind, not a fear of what was done to them by external forces, but a fear of what they were built with from the beginning. Something native to the gene of Leman Russ that has never been fully domesticated, only managed. The Canis helix. The genetic catalyst that gives space wolves their extraordinary sensory gifts. The ability to smell emotions and intentions in the chemical signals that permeate human sweat. To hear heartbeats across distances that would be impressive for ordinary humans with sophisticated equipment. To track by scent through environments that would defeat the best of human hunting dogs. The helix is also what gives them their fangs, their particular ferocity, the feral quality to their aggression that distinguishes them from other chapters' kind of violence. All of this from the same source. All of it, the extraordinary gifts and the terrifying flaw, wound together in the genome of a Primarch who was himself only partially domesticated. Or when a Space Wolf's aspirant drinks from the cup of Wolfen, an ancient relic containing the genetic cocktail that activates the Canis helix, the transformation that follows is described in terms that make the Blood Angel's gene seed activation sound restrained. Bones split and buckle. Coarse hair erupts across the body. The aspirant reverts, temporarily, to a bestial state in which the hunger for raw meat becomes the most pressing reality in his consciousness, in which the higher cognitive functions that distinguish a person from an animal recede behind drives that are much older and much simpler than thought. He is then taken out to the Fenrisian wilderness, one of the most hostile and lethal environments that the Imperium has catalogued, as a world that experiences such extremes of volcanic catastrophe that its landmasses reform on geologically rapid timescales, where the fauna have evolved for millions of years under conditions that select aggressively for deadliness, and told to find his way back to the Fang, without a map, without equipment beyond whatever he can find or build, while fighting both the physical environment and the genetic storm raging inside his own body. Those who return are space wolves. Those who do not, those who cannot hold the beast at bay long enough to navigate the wilderness, who lose themselves entirely to the feral state the helix induces, become Wolfen. They remain in the wilderness, fully transformed, still vaguely bipedal, but no longer recognizably human in behavior, their intelligence now entirely predatory. They hunt. That is all they do. They hunt in the wilderness of their homeworld, occasionally hunting the next wave of aspirants who come to take the same test they failed. The critical point is this: passing the test does not close the door on the beast. It locks it. The lock holds for as long as the warrior maintains the specific discipline of mind and spirit that wolf priests spend their careers cultivating in their brothers. In moments of extreme stress, in the peaks of battle where consciousness strips down to its most essential components, where the higher functions of planning and language and self-monitoring become expensive luxuries, the lock can loosen. The beast can push. A wolf priest may need to physically intervene, speaking to a brother who is losing the thread, reminding him of his name and his pack and his place in the human world, and pulling him back from an edge that was getting close. The history of what happens when this management fails on a large scale is one of the saddest stories in Space Marine lore. When the Space Wolves tried to create successor chapters after the Horus Heresy, the Wolf Brothers were the result. A new chapter that inherited the gene seed of Leman Russ and attempted to build a chapter culture around it without the particular combination of tradition, institutional knowledge, and wolf priest expertise that makes the Canis helix survivable in the parent chapter. The Canis helix, destabilized by its removal from the specific cultural context that had evolved to contain it, ran wild. Warriors fell to the curse in groups. There were not enough stable members left to help the fallen, not enough wolf priests to serve the monitoring function, or not enough institutional support for the constant management that the helix requires. The Wolf Brothers effectively dissolved, not destroyed in battle, but consumed from within by the thing they were built from. The Space Wolves have not successfully created a successor chapter since. The gene seed of Lehman Russ, sometime after the Horus Heresy, developed an additional complication. It became compatible only with humans from Fenris. The specific environmental pressures and the specific genetic characteristics of Fenrisian humans are, apparently, necessary for the Canis helix to be activatable at all. This means the Space Wolves cannot recruit from anywhere else, cannot diversify their gene pool, cannot draw on the broader human populations that other chapters use to maintain their numbers. They are, in the deepest sense, alone with their wolf. There is a philosophical taunt that Magnus the Red reportedly made during his assault on the Fang, words that have stuck in the Space Wolves' cultural memory across 10,000 years in ways that only truly threatening things do. There are no wolves on Fenris. The implication was that the boundary between the Space Wolves and the Wolfen, between the warriors and the monsters that lurk in their wilderness and in their blood, is thinner than the chapter cares to admit. That the wolves the Space Wolves see when they look at the fauna of their homeworld are really the same thing that lives inside every brother, just given slightly different conditions to express itself in. The Space Wolves dismissed this as the malicious provocation of a traitor. They are probably right to do so. But the fact that they dismissed it so forcefully, that the phrase has stayed attached to the chapter's cultural memory the way a barb stays in flesh, suggests that it touched something real, not a truth to be accepted, a possibility to be refused, every single day. The specific fear that this generates is not exactly the fear of personal loss. Space Wolves are not particularly afraid for themselves in a conventional sense. The fear is more specific to their culture, which is probably the most intensely communal of any Space Marine chapter. The pack, the brotherhood, the great company, the bonds between warriors who have bled together across centuries, are the central organizing principle of everything about how they live and fight and understand their own existence. The fear is of being cast out of that, of becoming Wolfen, of losing the thread that connects you to the brothers, of becoming something that can no longer be in the pack because the pack is a concept that requires a level of social reasoning you no longer possess. The loss of self is painful. The loss of belonging is devastating. For a being whose identity is built on the specific foundation of knowing exactly where he stands in relation to his brothers, and whose brothers know where he stands in relation to them, becoming Wolfen is not just a biological catastrophe. It is the end of being the kind of thing he was made to be. The Tyranids. When the stars go silent and nothing answers back. Every fear we have discussed so far has been, in some form, a fear about the interior, about what Space Marines might become, about what their genetics might do to them. It's about the integrity of the systems that make them what they are. These are genuine and profound fears, but they share a quality of being, ultimately, internal problems. Problems that better management, better conditioning, better vigilance might address. Now we turn to something qualitatively different. A fear from outside. A fear that responds to none of the tools that Space Marine culture has developed for managing the dangers that come from within. A fear that is not about corruption or loss of self or the fragility of genetic lines, but about a form of threat so fundamentally different from anything the Astartes were originally designed to face that entire new chapters had to be founded specifically to address it. When a Tyranid hive fleet comes, it does not arrive with heralds, and it does not issue declarations of war or make demands that can be negotiated. The first indication that something is wrong is more subtle and more terrifying than any approaching fleet could be. The stars go quiet. The shadow in the warp, the psychic phenomenon generated by the collective presence of the Tyranid hive mind, is not produced by intention in any way that current understanding can confirm. It may be an unavoidable byproduct of the constant, massive psychic activity of billions of alien minds in continuous communication with each other. Every Tyranid organism is telepathically connected to the hive mind, receiving and transmitting a continuous stream of information that coordinates the behavior of the entire swarm with a precision that no conventional command structure could match. The sheer volume of this traffic, that the psychic noise produced by what amounts to the entire swarm thinking simultaneously, creates a blanket of interference in the warp that drowns out everything else in its vicinity. The warp is, among other things, the medium through which all interstellar communication flows in the Imperium. Astropaths use it to send and receive messages across the void. Navigators use it to steer through FTL travel. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon at the heart of the Imperium, burns in it to guide ships safely. When the shadow falls, all of this stops. Astropaths cannot reach out. Navigators lose their bearings. Communication between star systems in the affected area becomes impossible. Reinforcements cannot be summoned. Coordinated responses cannot be organized. And yet the worlds that find themselves under the shadow are cut off from the wider Imperium with a thoroughness that no conventional siege could achieve. And they cannot even send a warning before the isolation is complete. By the time the shadow is thick enough to notice, it is already too late to use the channels it is blocking. For Space Marine chapters that depend on psychic communication, which is to say, all of them, this creates a specific tactical nightmare. The librarians, whose psychic gifts are among a chapter's most versatile assets, find their abilities dramatically degraded under the shadow. The constant alien interference makes focused use of the warp intensely difficult, like trying to conduct a delicate surgery while someone runs a generator inside the operating room. At worst, a librarian attempting to use his gifts under the shadow is subjected to the full sensory impact of the hive mind's neural traffic, a sound that some survivors have described as 10,000 mouths, all screaming in a language built from a grammar that the human mind was not made to pass. Astropaths, who are more sensitive and less protected than librarians, have broken their own skulls against bulkheads trying to escape the noise. Beyond the communications problem, the Tyranids themselves fight in a way that specifically challenges the martial tradition that Space Marines were built from. Space Marine combat doctrine at its core is about identifying critical nodes and disrupting them. Find the enemy's command structure, eliminate it. Watch the coherent enemy force degrade into confused individuals. This is a doctrine developed against enemies that have command structures, that have generals, that have headquarters and supply chains, and all the other organizational features that armies built from mortal beings necessarily have. The hive mind has none of these. There is no general to assassinate. There is no headquarters to destroy. The hive mind is distributed across the entire swarm simultaneously. Kill a hive tyrant, which requires the coordinated effort of a significant force and considerable casualties, and the swarm does not falter. The synaptic connections simply redistribute through other synapse creatures. The tactical picture continues seamlessly, without even a moment of confusion to exploit. The Tyranids have all the tactical adaptability of a centralized command structure and none of the vulnerability. They cannot be demoralized. They do not experience despair. They have no sense of territorial attachment to any position, so they cannot be provoked by the threat of losing ground they care about. They do not have anything analogous to the will to fight that can be broken or exhausted. They fight because the hive mind directs them to fight, and the hive mind does not tire, does not hesitate, does not negotiate, does not flinch. The Battle of Macragge remains one of the defining demonstrations of what this means in practice. The Ultramarines, the chapter whose Primarch wrote the Codex Astartes, whose tactical tradition is the foundation that most other chapters build from, who are arguably the most comprehensively trained warriors in the Adeptus Astartes, faced Hive Fleet Behemoth at their homeworld with everything they had. They won. Just barely, at cost so severe it took centuries to rebuild from. The polar fortresses fell. Entire companies were destroyed. The first company, the most experienced and heavily armored warriors in the chapter, suffered catastrophic casualties fighting in the Tyranid-infested spaces beneath the fortress walls. And Behemoth was one hive fleet. One tendril of one fleet from a species that has apparently consumed other galaxies before arriving in this one. The Imperium has identified several hive fleets, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and others, and fought each of them at enormous cost. What nobody in the Imperium can say with confidence is how many more are coming. The approach vectors suggest that different fleets have come from different directions, implying that what the Milky Way is experiencing may be the advance edge of a consumption event that encompasses a significant portion of the local galactic neighborhood. The specific horror of the Tyranids for a space marine who allows himself to think about it at scale is the horror of consumption without meaning. When a warrior dies fighting chaos, the death means something. It is resistance against something that actively wants the universe to bow to its will, and resistance is its own form of statement. When a warrior dies fighting Necrons, even that has meaning. You are facing something ancient that seeks to reclaim what it believes it owns, and refusing to yield to that claim is itself a declaration. But the Tyranids do not want anything that can be related to in terms of values or ideology, or even the cold logic of strategic interest. They consume. The Imperium's worlds are not enemies to the Tyranids. They are not threats. They are not even obstacles. They are food. The people who live on them, the cultures they have built, the history they carry, none of this registers to the hive mind in any way. It is all just biomass waiting to be recycled. For warriors whose entire existence is built on the meaning of sacrifice, on the idea that what they do matters in a cosmos where meaning is possible, the Tyranids are an argument against meaning, not a philosophical argument, a biological one, made with synapse creatures and bioacid and the simple consuming indifference of a process that does not know it is an argument. Art the Necrons, undying, soulless, and coming anyway. If the Tyranids represent the fear of consumption without meaning, then the Necrons represent something different. A fear that is in some ways more personal, more specifically targeted at the nature of Space Marines themselves. The Necrons are what happens when an intelligent species achieves immortality through the wrong kind of process. 60 million years ago, they were the Necrontire, a mortal, flesh and blood civilization that lived under a radiation-soaked star that gave them cancers before they reached what should have been middle age. They were brilliant, and they were desperate, and they were consumed with envy of the old ones, an elder species whose members lived for millions of years without apparent suffering. The Necrontire made a deal with entities that were ancient before the galaxy's current stars were born. These were the Satan, star gods who had seeded themselves through solar systems across the galaxy and fed on the energies of the stars they inhabited. The Cetan offered the Necrontire immortality through biotransference, the process of having their consciousnesses transferred into bodies of living metal, called necrodermis, that could not age and could not be easily destroyed. The process required each Necrontire to be disassembled, their organic body dismantled. The Satan fed on the life energy that poured out during this process. What remained in the metal body was the consciousness without the soul, the mind without the thing that makes a mind more than just information processing. The Silent King, Zarek, he watched this happen to his people and understood the magnitude of his mistake. His new body was stronger than his old one. His thoughts were clearer. The constant pain that had accompanied his entire mortal existence was gone. And there was a terrible emptiness where something essential had been. He knew with cold certainty that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of his soul. The Necrons that woke in the 41st millennium after 60 million years of dormancy are these beings. Minds preserved in metal, technically alive in any definition that doesn't include the soul, fighting with sophisticated tactical intelligence and the patience of entities that do not age and have all the time that the universe contains. They are not stupid. The overlords and pharaons and cryptex of the major Necron dynasties are among the most intelligent entities currently active in the galaxy, their mental capabilities refined, and their memory banks containing information about the history of the universe that predates the human species by geological epochs. They scheme, they plan, they remember every grudge, every defeat, every insult, with perfect fidelity. On the battlefield, what this produces is one of the most fundamentally discouraging experiences in the Space Marines' tactical catalogue. Necron warriors, armed with Gauss weaponry that strips targets apart at the molecular level, are individually less powerful than a Space Marine in a one-on-one engagement. The challenge is that they do not stay down. Necron reanimation protocols allow for self-repair from damage that would permanently destroy any biological organism or any conventional machine. Pour bolt rounds into a Necron warrior, watch it fall, and then watch it slowly and methodically reassemble itself from what should have been a pile of destroyed components. Stand and return to the fight. The living metal that composes their bodies flows and reforms around damage. Catastrophic injuries that would kill a Space Marine several times over, that would leave any other opponent on the field and no longer a tactical concern, leave a Necron incapacitated for variable amounts of time before the self-repair protocols return it to function. The psychological weight of this on warriors who have been trained to correlate application of sufficient firepower with the elimination of a threat is difficult to overstate. The fundamental contract of Space Marine combat doctrine, that effective violence produces results, is challenged in an immediate and practical way by opponents who accept effective violence and then simply stand back up. But there is something deeper than the tactical problem, and it is the thing that cuts closer to whatever philosophical core a Space Marine carries. The Necrons are what the Space Marines might have become if the Emperor had made different choices. The Space Marine transformation also takes a human being and replaces significant portions of his biology and psychology with augmented versions. While the conditioning also deliberately alters the emotional landscape, removing certain responses, redirecting others. The Space Marine also serves an eternal purpose in a body designed to be considerably more durable than the body he started with. He is also, in a meaningful sense, less than fully human, not soulless, not by any measure, but not quite human in the way he was before the transformation. The Necron stands at the far end of the spectrum that the Space Marine occupies somewhere in the middle of. Fully divorced from biological vulnerability, fully divorced from emotion in the experiential sense, though capable of intellectual analogues that sometimes fool outside observers into thinking they are experiencing genuine feeling. Carrying the consciousness without the soul, the Space Marine, contemplating the Necron, is contemplating a version of his own transformation taken to its logical conclusion. What the process of becoming something greater than human would look like if it proceeded to completion, if nothing were held back, if the transformation were total rather than partial. This is not a comfortable thing to contemplate. And then there are the Citan themselves, whose shards the Necrons now deploy as weapons. The Nightbringer, whose shard was accidentally freed by an ultramarine expedition in the 41st Millennium, is reportedly the entity that seeded the fear of death into every sentient species in the galaxy. Simply by existing in proximity to them, this star god burned the awareness of mortality so deeply into the racial consciousness that it became an instinct rather than a thought. When a Space Marine faces a Citan shard, he is facing a being that was old when the universe was young, whose power is of a qualitatively different order than anything the training was designed to prepare him for, whose very existence challenges the framework within which Space Marine psychology makes sense. You cannot meet a Citan shard with the usual confidence that sufficient application of skill and force will produce the desired result. The Citan are not subject to the same rules that everything else is subject to. They are categories of being, not individuals, and facing a category of being is a different experience than facing any number of individual enemies. And facing the mirror, Chaos Space Marines, and the recognition. There is a moment, and it comes up often enough in the fiction that it has become something like a structural feature of the storytelling, where a loyalist Space Marine encounters a Chaos Space Marine on the battlefield and pauses. The pause is almost invisible. It might last a fraction of a second, but it is there, and it is specific. and it is the recognition of something that the conditioning did not fully prepare him for. The enemy moves like him, not exactly like him, not with the same purpose or the same orientation or the same ultimate cause, but with the same fundamental grammar of motion, the particular efficiency of a body that was built to the same architectural specifications and trained to the same foundational standards. Here, the Chaos Space Marine carries the same general proportions, uses weapons that were either made in the same forges or designed to imitate them, employs tactics that draw from the same foundational martial tradition, even when they have been adapted for different purposes. The thing across the battlefield is, in a technical biological sense, the same thing as the warrior who faces it. Except everything the conditioning was meant to protect, the loyalty, the devotion, the specific orientation of the tremendous capacities toward the Emperor's service, has been corrupted, or was lost, or was willingly discarded in exchange for something that the Chaos Space Marine decided was worth more. The 9 traitor legions that followed Horus into the Eye of Terror are not simply criminal organizations or misguided rebels. They are, in many cases, and something more interesting and more terrible than that. The Night Lords, for instance, do not fight for any particular Chaos God's favor. They fight because they believe the Imperium is an instrument of brutality, and they have decided that the best response to an empire of brutality is to be the most efficient possible practitioners of the thing they despise. Their leader, Conrad Kurze, was a Primarch who saw visions of the future, awful visions of what his legion would eventually do, and who chose, with a kind of terrible clarity, to walk toward those visions anyway, because the alternative was to abandon the only identity he had. The Word-bearers, who were the first to fall, and who drove the chain of corruption that produced the Horus heresy, did not fall because they were weak. And they fell because their Primarch Lorgar had a genuine and profound spiritual longing, a hunger for the divine, that the Emperor told him was misguided and publicly humiliated him for expressing. The Chaos Gods were waiting with an answer to that longing that the Emperor had refused to provide. The corruption of the Word-bearers is, in its origins, a story about what happens when genuine devotion has nowhere legitimate to go. These are not simple stories. They are not stories in which the moral choices are easy to read from the outside or the inside. And this is precisely what makes the traitor legions so specifically frightening to loyalist Space Marines. Because the stories of how they fell are recognizable stories. The pride, the betrayed devotion, the frustrated purpose, and the grievance that might have been addressed differently if anyone had tried. These are things that any sufficiently honest Astartes can find something to recognize in. The Word-bearers are perhaps the most sophisticated practitioners of the specific art of corruption in the galaxy. They have spent 10,000 years studying both the theology of the Imperial Creed and the metaphysics of the ruinous powers, developing an expertise that no one in the Imperium can match, because no one in the Imperium is willing to look at both things at the same depth simultaneously. When they engage loyalist Space Marines in combat, their goal is not simply to win the battle. It is to find the specific spiritual weakness that their enemy carries, and to apply pressure to it in a way that leaves something behind, a doubt, a question, a crack in the certainty that the conditioning was designed to make absolute. The Alpha Legion, who may or may not serve the ruinous powers in any straightforward sense, their motivations remain genuinely unclear, even after 10,000 years of attempting to understand them, specialize in the specific kind of warfare that Space Marines are least equipped to counter. Not frontal assault, not overwhelming force, information warfare, identity disruption, infiltration so deep and so patient that by the time the enemy realizes what is happening, the reliable facts about who can be trusted have become uncertain. They have agents in positions that would be extraordinary to believe they occupy, if the evidence did not sometimes emerge. They have been known to replace entire squads with operatives who maintained their cover through battles that should have exposed them. The Alpha Legion is frightening because they attack the specific foundation that makes a Space Marine's confidence possible. The certainty that his brothers are who he thinks they are, that the information he is acting on is accurate, that the mission is what he has been told it is. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending enough time fighting the traitor legions. Not physical exhaustion, which Space Marine physiology handles better than almost anything, but something like the exhaustion of maintaining certainty in an environment that is specifically designed to undermine it. The Alpha Legion's enemy does not always know they are fighting the Alpha Legion. Sometimes they only find out afterward, when the pattern of what happened becomes visible in retrospect, and even then, they are not always certain. The institutional fear, the scale of what they cannot do. There is a fear that Space Marine culture is not well equipped to name. It would be, in some sense, a form of disloyalty to name it, or at least, the culture has evolved structures that make naming it feel like disloyalty, which may amount to the same thing functionally. It is the fear that sits at the base of all the institutional work that the Adeptus Astartes does, the fear that motivates the creation of the Death Watch and the Grey Knights, and the specific way that Space Marine chapters are spread across the galaxy rather than consolidated. It is the fear that the war is going badly, not a battle or a campaign or a sector conflict, not any particular engagement, which can always be improved upon with better tactics and better intelligence and better preparation. The fear is structural, residing in the mathematics of the whole enterprise, in the awareness of what the Imperium faces and the awareness of what the Imperium has available to face it with. There are approximately 1,000 Space Marine chapters. Each maintains a theoretical strength of 1,000 warriors, 1 million Space Marines total, in a galaxy of hundreds of billions of inhabited worlds, fighting on essentially every front simultaneously, against enemies whose numbers in most cases exceed the entire Space Marine establishment by orders of magnitude that are difficult to comprehend at a human scale. The Tyranids that approached from extragalactic space brought numbers that dwarf anything the Imperium could put in the field, and this was the approach of a species that has apparently done this before to other galaxies. The orc population of the Milky Way and orcs are effectively immortal, barring deliberate killing, because the spores they shed continue to produce new orcs in perpetuity, likely outnumbers humanity by a significant margin and continues to grow regardless of any particular victory the Imperium wins against them. The Necrons have been asleep for 60 million years, and the fraction of them that have woken so far have already demonstrated technology that the Imperium cannot replicate, and in several cases cannot effectively counter. This is not a war being won. It is, at best, a war being not yet lost. And the distinction matters. The scythes of the Emperor's internal crisis, when they were reduced to a fraction of their strength by Hive Fleet Kraken, crystallized this institutional fear in unusually explicit terms. The debate between surviving veterans who wanted to die with honor intact and leadership that wanted to rebuild and continue was not really a tactical debate. It was a philosophical one about what a Space Marine chapter is for, about whether the mission is to win battles or to continue fighting them, about whether surviving long enough to fight again is itself a form of success, or whether survival purchased at the cost of combat effectiveness is a form of slow failure. The founding of the Grey Knights represents the most extreme institutional acknowledgement of this fear. The Emperor, before the Siege of Terra, has looked at the threat posed by demonic incursion, the specific ways in which the power of chaos could manifest in the material world through the psychic weaknesses of human minds, and concluded that the standard Adeptus Astartes, formidable as they were not sufficient to address it. He needed something more specialized, more specifically resistant to the exact threat, something whose gene seed was so carefully guarded that the Adeptus Mechanicus did not even know its full nature, whose conditioning went several layers deeper than anything in the standard Space Marine process, whose members carried the names of every soul they had been required to cleanse and bore that weight as a permanent reminder of the cost. The Grey Knights exist because the Emperor acknowledged a gap. And acknowledging a gap means acknowledging that the existing structure was insufficient to fill it. Every successive founding of new chapters is, in part, another acknowledgement of the same kind, the recognition that what exists is not enough for what faces it, that the gap between the Imperium's defensive capacity and the threats arrayed against it must be addressed by creating more of what defends it. Hundreds of new chapters have been founded since the second founding, immediately after the Horus heresy. More are founded in the era Indomitus, with the Ultima founding providing Primaris Space Marine reinforcements that some chapters have received with gratitude and others with varying degrees of suspicion. None of it closes the gap. The gap is too large, too fundamental, too structural to close. What Space Marine chapters provide is not security in any absolute sense. What they provide is the specific kind of fighting capacity that keeps the not yet lost from becoming lost this week, this month, this decade. The endless deferral of an outcome that the mathematics, if you look at them honestly, do not fully support hoping to avoid. This is the institutional fear that runs beneath all the specific fears we have discussed. The fear that the chapter cannot do what it was made to do because what it was made to do is too large, that the mission is real and the devotion is genuine and the sacrifice is total, and that it may not be enough. What makes Space Marines extraordinary is that they fight anyway. Not because the mathematics are reassuring, because the alternative, to stop fighting, to accept the outcome that the mathematics suggest, is not an alternative. It is simply not a category that the conditioning produced, or that the culture sustains, or that the warrior who has spent his life in this particular fire is capable of inhabiting. The small fears, what the scale cannot swallow. Not every Space Marine fear operates at the scale of galaxy-spanning extinction or cosmic-level corruption. There are smaller, quieter fears that reveal the interior life of these warriors, with a different kind of precision. These are the fears that emerge in the Black Library fiction, when authors take the time to sit inside a Space Marine's head, rather than just describe him from outside. The fear of meaningless death. As Space Marines can accept death in battle, they are trained to regard it not as the worst possible outcome, but as the natural conclusion of a life spent in the Emperor's service, a completion rather than an interruption. What they cannot accept as easily is death that serves no purpose. Death in an accident. Death from friendly fire. Death in an operation that fails not because of the enemy's strength, but because of poor planning on the Imperial side, because of bad intelligence, because of decisions made by people who were not in the killing ground and did not fully understand what they were sending warriors into. The warrior who falls in a last stand that holds a critical point until reinforcements arrive has died well. The warrior who falls because a commander made a preventable error has died badly. This distinction matters enormously to Space Marine psychology, and the fear of the second kind of death is real in ways that the fear of death itself is not. The fear of separation from the Brotherhood. Individual isolation, physical aloneness, is something Space Marines handle with considerable equanimity, but institutional separation, being cut off from the chapter, declared renegade, excommunicated, regarded by the brothers who were once trusted companions as something to be hunted. This is different. The Death Watch, which requires warriors to leave their home chapters for potentially years or decades, faces this in a milder form. The operative serves effectively and with genuine commitment, but he is operating without the deep roots of his chapter's particular culture, while building new bonds with warriors from different traditions in a context that does not entirely feel like home. The full version, the excommunicate, the warrior declared traitor by the institution that gave his existence its meaning, is one of the more devastating psychological experiences the lore depicts. The fear of failing a brother, not failing the mission in the abstract, but failing specifically in the duty of care to a particular warrior whose life depended on decisions you made. The weight of command in Space Marine culture is not simply the weight of authority, it is the weight of responsibility for the warriors who follow your decisions, who go where you point them, who die in the dispositions you chose. A sergeant who loses a squad, a captain who commits a company to a position that proves untenable, a chapter master who sends warriors to a mission from which they do not return, when different choices might have changed the outcome. This weight is felt. It does not paralyze. The conditioning prevents that, but it accumulates in the organic memory that the transformation leaves intact, in ways that shape decisions across decades of service. And quietly, underlying all of these, the fear that is perhaps the least expressible in the vocabulary Space Marine culture provides. The fear that what was human in them before the transformation is gone in ways that cannot be recovered, and that the loss is larger than was understood when it was made. This one appears in the fiction in coded forms, in moments of unexpected recognition. In the particular way certain Space Marine characters respond to encounters with ordinary civilians, or to situations that should have no emotional content, but somehow do. The warrior who finds himself pausing for a longer moment than is tactically necessary over the ruins of something that was once a family home. The sergeant who spends his free hours carving wood, or painting, or practicing a skill that has no military application, as if maintaining some connection to something that the conditioning was supposed to replace entirely. As to the Black Library's best authors understand that this fear cannot be directly acknowledged within the fiction without doing damage to the character. A Space Marine cannot look directly at the question of what he lost without it becoming something that undermines him in ways the culture does not have the tools to repair. But the best fiction circles around it, implies it, lets it exist in the spaces between what is said and what is felt. Ulrich Wehner, the fictional brother captain who gave his voice to the narrative tradition this channel works within, found at the end of centuries of existence as a dreadnought that the last meaningful battle of his long career was the battle to remain human in the only sense that still mattered to him. Not human in body, that was long gone, but human in the capacity to care and to form genuine connections, to feel the losses and victories around him as things that mattered, rather than as tactical data to be processed and stored. He won that battle, in the end, and the winning of it was also his death, because the price of staying human was accepting the limits of what the machine could sustain. But he died at peace, and in the deeply honest story that his author was telling, that peace was earned, not given. It was the specific peace of someone who chose what mattered and chose it fully, and did not pretend that the choosing was easy. The final accounting, what fear reveals and what it cannot hide. We have been in this dark place for a long time now, yet we have walked through the catalogue of the angels of death's deepest fears, from the corruption that lives inside every Space Marine's gene seed of pride and fury, waiting for the right pressure applied in the right place, all the way to the small and private fears that never get named in the battle prayers or the funeral rites. What does it all add up to? I think what it tells us, more clearly than almost anything else in the lore, is that Space Marines are not weapons. The Emperor designed them as weapons, and they function with the precision and lethality that a weapon is supposed to have. But a weapon does not have fears, and the Space Marines do. The fears that survived the conditioning, that could not be removed or were left in place intentionally, are the evidence of something that the transformation could not eliminate, something that persists because it is not, at its core, the kind of thing that biological or psychological engineering can reach. The fear of corruption is a fear about integrity. You cannot fear becoming false unless you genuinely value honesty. You cannot fear betraying a loyalty unless the loyalty is real in a way that matters to you independently of any reward for maintaining it. Every Space Marine who worries, however deeply buried the worry is, about the particular form of degradation that chaos represents, is a Space Marine who genuinely cares about what the Emperor represents, genuinely believes that service means something, genuinely understands that becoming the opposite of what you swore to be is a loss that cannot be compensated. That the fear of gene seed failure is a fear about continuity, about future generations that do not yet exist having the possibility of existing. This is the kind of fear that requires caring about something beyond yourself, about whether the thing you are part of will outlast you, about whether the sacrifices made now will mean something to warriors who won't be born for a century. It is, at its core, a fear that expresses genuine love for the institution, not just as a context for service, but as an end in itself worth protecting. The Blood Angels' fear is the fear of losing what makes them themselves, of having the specific consciousness that has made all their choices and carried all their history consumed by something that does not recognize any of that history as meaningful. This is the existential fear of the individual in its most refined form, not the fear of death, but the fear of being replaced by something that wears your body, but is not you. The Space Wolf's fear is the fear of exclusion from meaning, from the pack, the brotherhood, the network of relationships that makes the warrior more than a soldier and makes his service more than a job. This fear requires that the relationships be genuine, that the brotherhood be real in a way that cannot be faked or performed. And the fear of the Tyranids is a fear about whether meaning itself is possible in a universe that contains the hive mind. The fear that the framework of purpose and sacrifice and resistance within which Space Marine existence makes sense might be confronted with something that has no interest in the framework and would consume it along with everything else without even registering what it had done. The fear of the Necrons is the fear of a choice that was made wrong, the fear of what it means to take the essential transformation that Space Marines undergo and push it past the point where anything human remains. It is the fear of looking at a monument to one possible future and recognizing in it some of the same decisions that were made in your own past, now arrived at their logical destination. The fear of the traitor. Legions is the fear of recognition, of seeing your own beginnings in the origin stories of your worst enemies, of knowing that the road to damnation started somewhere that looked, from the outside, approximately like where you are standing. All of these fears share something in common. They are fears that require the Space Marine to value something enough that its loss would matter. A being with no real attachments, no genuine values, nothing it actually cares about. Such a being would have no fears. The fears we have catalogued today are the proof that the conditioning did not, and perhaps could not, fully replace whatever was human in the aspirants who became these warriors. The Emperor said, "They shall know no fear," and perhaps what he meant was something more nuanced than the words suggest. Perhaps what he meant was that they shall know the right fears, the fears worth having, the fears that are evidence of genuine attachment to genuine things. Not the fear that comes from caring about your own survival, but the fear that comes from caring about something larger, older, and more important than any individual. They know no fear of death. They know no fear of pain or discomfort or physical suffering beyond what the body forces on them in its most extreme states. They know no fear of the darkness or the void or the alien or the strange. But they know every fear that requires you to care about something worth caring about. And those fears, in the end, are the most human thing about them. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, and this was a long journey, I want to acknowledge that. Then you have done something that I genuinely appreciate. This kind of deep, patient engagement with the lore is exactly what this channel is built for. And the fact that you are still here means something. The fears that run through Space Marine culture are one of the most quietly compelling threads in all of Warhammer 40,000, because they reveal what these warriors actually are beneath the armor, beneath the conditioning, beneath the 10,000 years of accumulated martial tradition. They reveal what the Angels of Death actually care about. And what they care about, it turns out, is in many ways genuinely admirable. Even when the specific expression of that care is alien and strange and filtered through a consciousness that has been significantly altered from the human baseline. If this video resonated with you, if it gave you a new angle on the Astartes, or reminded you why you got interested in the lore in the first place, the best thing you can do for this channel is drop a like and hit subscribe. It takes about 2 seconds, and it matters more than you might realize for getting this kind of slower, more immersive content to the people who are looking for it. The 41st Millennium is vast and dark and full of stories worth telling with care. I will be back soon with another one. The Emperor Protects. The Dreadnought's Dilemma. The fear of being saved. There is a horror in the Warhammer universe that does not make it into the battle reports, that is never formally listed among the dangers Space Marines face, that the Adeptus Astartes' own propaganda consistently frames as an honor and a gift, and a continuation of glorious service. The horror of the Dreadnought. When a Space Marine is catastrophically wounded past the ability of even Space Marine biology to repair, past the art of the apothecaries, past the point where any therapy could return him to functional service, there is a procedure available to certain exceptional warriors. Their ruined body is interred within a sarcophagus of iron and adamantium, life support systems threading into what remains of their organic flesh and maintaining the spark of consciousness that the damage has not yet extinguished. The walking war machine that results, the Dreadnought, is among the most formidable battlefield assets a chapter possesses. And 2.5 to 3 meters of adamantium hull housing, millennia of accumulated wisdom and skill. Weapons capable of tearing apart armored vehicles. A presence on the battlefield that combines the morale effect of a legendary warrior with the firepower of a light tank. The Codex Astartes calls it the highest honor. The chapter's traditions surround it with ceremony and reverence. The warriors interred within dreadnoughts are referred to as the Ancient Ones, the honored dead, the sleeping veterans. Their counsel is sought before major engagements. Their approval carries weight in chapter decisions. They are venerated in a way that sits just below the veneration of the Primarchs themselves. And if you listen very carefully to the lore, beneath the official framing, there is something darker. As the Dreadnought does not simply preserve a warrior in a more effective form, it introduces him to a specific and terrible relationship with time. Between battles, the Ancient One sleeps. Not the sleep of rest that mortal beings experience, where consciousness dims and returns refreshed, but something closer to the death that was denied him. A void, a total absence. There is no experience of the intervening time. There is the moment before the sarcophagus sealed, and then there is the moment of awakening, and between them there is nothing whatsoever. Not darkness, not dreams, nothing. A Space Marine who was interred in the 32nd Millennium and awakened in the 41st has, subjectively, experienced a gap of 0 seconds. But the world he awakens into is 10,000 years changed. The brothers he knew are dead, and the causes he fought for have resolved in ways he was not present to witness. The chapter he served has been through crises and triumphs that he missed entirely, preserved in his sarcophagus, while generations of warriors lived and died around him. The older dreadnoughts, the ones who have been sleeping and waking for multiple centuries or even millennia, speak differently than younger warriors. Their memories have a particular quality to them that younger brothers do not share. The organic portions of their brain, the parts that cannot be replaced by the machine, are subject to the same gradual degradation that affects all biological tissue over extremely long timescales. Memories fade, not the tactical memories, which the machine can maintain. The personal ones, the faces of brothers, and the specific weight of a particular weapon that fit perfectly in a particular hand. The sound of laughter from someone who has been dead for 800 years. With each awakening, there is a little less of the man who went in. What remains is increasingly the machine. The tactical knowledge, the combat skill, the preserved mission parameters, rather than the individual who held all of those things in the context of a human life. This is the Dreadnought's specific fear, and it is one that the wider Space Marine community rarely has to articulate because few of them face it directly. But the Dreadnoughts know it. The most ancient of them, those who have been awake and asleep for so long that they have trouble distinguishing the crusade they fought in from the current engagement. They carry it in the particular quality of their silence between words. The fear is this: salvation is also a kind of consumption. The dreadnought was saved from death. It was also saved by degrees from everything else. The honor is real. The service continues, the mission goes on, and the individual, slowly, does not. What does a space marine who has survived long enough to face this prospect actually fear more? The death that was prevented, or the slow dissolution of self that the prevention entails? The law, characteristically, does not answer this directly. It circles the question. It shows you dreadnoughts who have found a kind of peace in their reduced state, who have made terms with the machine and found meaning in continuing to serve. And it shows you others who have not, who wake with a desperation that is visible even through the armor, who ask questions about people who have been dead for centuries, who seem to be searching for something that keeps not being there. Brother Ancient Bjorn, the fell-handed of the Space Wolves, is the oldest active dreadnought in the Adeptus Astartes. He fought beside Lemon Russ himself, was interred after wounds received in the 31st Millennium, and has been awakening periodically ever since, whenever a crisis demands his counsel or his guns. He is, by most accounts, the most reliable source of information about events before the heresy in the Space Wolves' living institutional memory. He is also, by some accounts, increasingly difficult to reach. The consciousness that answers when he is woken is genuinely Bjorn, but a Bjorn that has been worn down by centuries of intermittent existence, that holds his memories with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows they are becoming fragile. Bjorn has been asked what it is like, and his reported answers have varied across the editions of the lore in ways that may reflect the writer's varying interpretations, or may reflect genuine variation in how Bjorn answers, depending on when, in his long history, he is awakened. Some accounts have him speak of his condition with equanimity, even contentment, a warrior who has accepted his situation and found it sufficient. Others show something more complicated, a being who is aware of the loss without being able to fully articulate what was lost, and in the way that anyone who has misplaced something important but cannot quite remember what it was, experiences a peculiar combination of loss and confusion. The fear the dreadnought's situation illuminates is ultimately related to the fear of corruption, though its mechanism is completely different. Both involve the gradual replacement of the individual with something else. In corruption, it is chaos that does the replacing, using the warrior's own amplified emotions as raw material. In the dreadnought, it is time and the machine that do the replacing, using the slow erosion of biological memory and the increasing dominance of the mechanical systems as the organic components deteriorate. Both arrive at the same destination by different roads, a machine that continues to function, that continues to perform the mission, yet wearing the name and the legacy of someone who is not quite there anymore. The dark angels and the unforgiven, the fear of a secret that can never be resolved. There is a chapter in the Adeptus Astartes whose specific fear is so unusual in its character, so particular to their history, that no other chapter in the Imperium shares quite the same psychological burden. They do not fear what they might become. They fear what they already are, what they already were, what happened 10,000 years ago that they have been carrying ever since, and which they cannot disclose, and cannot resolve, and cannot simply leave behind and move past. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters, collectively known as the Unforgiven, hold a secret that the rest of the Imperium does not know. When the Horus heresy broke out, and a significant portion of the First Legion, the oldest and most prestigious of all the Space Marine legions, the chapter that carried the designation of the First, did not simply remain loyal or go traitor in the way that other legions did. Some of them did something more complicated, something that the Dark Angels have spent 10,000 years trying to manage, by hunting down every surviving member of the group, known as the Fallen, before any outside authority can reach them, before the Inquisition can question them, before anyone can learn what happened on Caliban at the end of the heresy. What happened on Caliban is still only partially disclosed even in the lore, But the broad outline is this. Luther, who had been Lionel Johnson's closest companion and surrogate father figure, turned against the Lion during the heresy, and not for chaos in the way that Horus turned against the Emperor, or at least not initially. The motivations are complex, and the historiography is contested even within the chapter. Luther led a significant portion of the First Legion that had remained on Caliban against the returning Lion and his loyalists. When Lionel Johnson's forces bombarded Caliban to end the conflict, a warp storm swept the surviving traitors into the Imperium, scattering them across time and space. These survivors, the Fallen, have been emerging at various points in the galaxy's history ever since, displaced from when they originally fell into the warp. The Dark Angels hunt them, relentlessly, secretly. When a Fallen is identified, the Dark Angels mobilize to capture him. Always capture, never simply kill, because they need the Fallen's repentance. A formal acknowledgement of the wrong that was done, and a final redemption before death that the chapter believes is the only way to complete the cycle that Luther began. The Fallen who refuse, who maintain their own justification for what happened, who die unrepentant. These are the ones that leave the Dark Angel's fear most intact. The fear is this: if the truth of what happened on Caliban were known, what would happen to the chapter? The Dark Angels have maintained their secret for 10,000 years through a combination of active concealment, internal discipline so absolute that any Dark Angel captured and in danger of torture is expected to kill himself rather than risk disclosure, and the simple reality that the people who know the full truth are very few and very carefully managed. But 10,000 years is a long time. The Fallen continue to emerge. The Inquisition continues to ask questions. The fabric of the secret has worn thin in places. The specific fear is not simply the fear of being caught. It is the fear of what discovery would mean for the chapter's identity. The Dark Angel's entire institutional self-understanding is built around their guilt and their redemption project. The Unforgiven are not called that because of what the rest of the Imperium thinks of them. They are called that because of what they think of themselves. They carry the weight of what their predecessors did on Caliban as a permanent penance, a reason to be always fighting harder, always going further, always accepting more dangerous missions. The secret is not just a thing they are hiding. It is a thing that has shaped the chapter's entire culture, its practices. It's the specific way its warriors understand their place in the cosmos. If the secret were resolved, if all the Fallen were found and brought to repentance or death, what would the Dark Angels be then? Who are the Unforgiven if they are no longer unforgiven? The project of redemption has become, over 10,000 years, the project itself. The chapter is partly defined by what it is trying to atone for, and the fear, in its deepest form, is not that the secret will be exposed and the chapter destroyed for what its predecessors did. The fear is that the project will never be completed, that the chapter will carry this weight forever, the Fallen always out there somewhere, the redemption always one more captured warrior away, the guilt never fully resolved. This is a kind of fear that most Space Marine chapters do not have the architecture to produce. Most chapters' fears are about what might happen in the future, what enemy might overwhelm them, what corruption might take them, what genetic failure might destroy them. The Dark Angel's fear is fundamentally about the past, about something that already happened, about a wound that has been managed and protected and carried for 10,000 years, but has never been allowed to fully close. The question of purpose. When there is no emperor to fight for, there is a theoretical fear in Space Marine culture that the culture is almost entirely organized to prevent anyone from fully contemplating, because fully contemplating it would be destabilizing in ways that would compromise the chapter's effectiveness. Like the fear of an emperor who might not be what they have been told he is. This one requires care in the handling because it is not a fear that operates in the same way as the others on this list. It is not a fear that many individual Space Marines consciously experience. The conditioning is too deep for that. The devotion is too structural, too load-bearing, too bound up with everything else about how a Space Marine understands his own existence. To consciously question the Emperor would be to consciously question the meaning of every sacrifice, every fallen brother, every year of service in conditions that would be intolerable for any ordinary being. But the law hints at it. It has been hinting at it for decades. The Emperor was not a god before the heresy. He explicitly refused to be called one, refused the temples and the prayers. He ordered his sons to dismantle the shrines that proliferated wherever his forces went. He described himself in terms that were explicitly not divine, a being of great power and great age, but a mortal origin, a being who would eventually die and should be understood as mortal. The Imperial Creed, which subsequent millennia developed into an elaborate theology of the God Emperor, would have horrified the Emperor as he was during the Great Crusade. And yet the Emperor is dead, or not dead, precisely. Not extinguished entirely, still something, still present in some form on the Golden Throne, still burning as the psychic lighthouse that makes the Astronomicon possible, still sending something that might be described as consciousness or intention into the universe even in his drastically diminished state. But not alive in any sense that would allow him to command, to advise, to answer the prayers directed at him, to confirm or correct the theology that has been built around him. The Space Marines fight for an emperor who cannot tell them whether what they are fighting for is what he would have wanted. They defend an institution that may have drifted significantly from the vision of its founder. They carry forward a mission whose parameters were set 10,000 years ago by a being who no longer exists in a form that can update them. What if the version of the Emperor that Space Marines fight for, the God Emperor of mankind, the divine protector, the being whose will the Codex Astartes interprets, is not what the Emperor actually was? What if the 10,000 years of theology and tradition and ritual have built something that the man on the Golden Throne would not recognize and would not sanction? The Space Marines are not equipped to ask this question out loud. The conditioning prevents it. The culture actively suppresses the space in which the question could be posed. And yet the question is there, in the background, in the specific discomfort that some chapters feel when confronted with the full weight of what the Imperium has become. The torture, the persecution, the witch hunts, the oppression of psychers and mutants, and anyone deemed different enough from the approved template to be declared heretic. Space Marines protect the Imperium. They protect its citizens, defend its institutions, fight its enemies. And the Imperium, as an institution, sometimes does things to its citizens that the angels of death, if they thought about it carefully, might not be able to fully endorse. Most do not think about it carefully. The conditioning ensures that. But in the fiction, in the quiet moments between battles, in the chapters that have retained more of the original Legion culture and its particular way of engaging with these questions, the Ghost Eagles, the Raven Guard with their more nuanced relationship with suffering, the Salamanders with their explicit commitment to protecting the people rather than just the institution. There are hints, glimpses, moments where a character looks at something the Imperium has done and experiences something that the narrative cannot quite call doubt, but that occupies the space where doubt would be. This fear, if it can be called a fear, as given how thoroughly the conditioning prevents it from becoming conscious, is perhaps the most dangerous one in the whole catalogue. Because if it were ever allowed to surface fully, to be examined honestly, it would not dissolve the Space Marines' purpose. The purpose is real, and the enemies are real, and the alternative to fighting them is not good. But it might change the quality of the devotion. It might make the service something more like a mature adult's chosen commitment to imperfect institutions, rather than a child's absolute faith in perfect ones. And whether that change would make the Space Marines more or less effective is a question the Imperium has never been willing to put to the test. Honor, brotherhood, and the weight of centuries, the slower fears. Let us come to a close with the fears that do not make it into battle prayers. The ones that are too small, individually, to constitute a formal threat, but which accumulate over the long decades and centuries of a Space Marine service into something weighty and real. The fear of irrelevance. Not in a personal sense. Space Marines are not prone to vanity about their own importance. But in a tactical sense, the fear that the skills they have spent decades mastering, the particular excellence they have developed in a specific domain of warfare, might be the wrong skills for the next war. The galaxy changes. Enemies change. The way fighting happens changes. A warrior who has spent 30 years mastering the particulars of urban warfare on hive worlds might find himself deployed to void combat or jungle operations, or worse, political negotiations that require skills that the training never fully addressed. The Space Marine who cannot adapt is not useless. The fundamental combat skills translate broadly, but the specific excellence he built may not be what is needed. The fear of leading brothers to deaths that could have been avoided. Every Space Marine officer carries the weight of the decisions they have made that cost lives. Not the lives legitimately spent in service of the mission, which is expected and accepted, but the lives that were spent unnecessarily, where different choices would have produced a different outcome. A sergeant who took a squad through a cleared route that turned out to not be fully cleared. A captain who trusted intelligence that turned out to be wrong. A chapter master who committed forces to a theater that was not the decisive one. These decisions, when they cost lives, leave marks on the officers who made them that the conditioning does not erase. They become part of how those officers think about subsequent decisions, adding a caution that must be balanced against the aggression that the mission requires. The fear of witnessing things that cannot be unseen. Space Marines encounter, with regularity, things that human minds were not designed to process. The aftermath of chaos cult activity. The biological nightmares of tyrannid digested worlds. The blasphemous geometry of spaces where the warp has touched reality for too long. As the evidence of what happens when entire populations are subjected to malevolent supernatural attention. The conditioning provides some protection against the psychological damage these sites would cause an ordinary person, but not complete protection. The most ancient Space Marines carry, in the deepest chambers of their memory, images that they do not choose to revisit, but that surface sometimes in the moments between sleep and waking, a catalogue of everything that the universe contains that should not be possible. The fear of watching brothers change. This one is particularly acute for the oldest warriors in any chapter, the ones who have served long enough to watch the turnover of entire generations of brothers, who have seen younger warriors they mentored rise through the ranks and fall in battle, who have watched the culture of the chapter subtly shift over decades as leadership changes and priorities evolve, and the current war demands different things than the last one. The specific attachment that develops between warriors who have served together for decades is among the deepest emotional bonds that Space Marine psychology produces. Watching those bonds end, whether through death, through excommunication, through the slow drift of a brother who is still present physically but is no longer quite the person who used to fight on your left, leaves traces that neither the conditioning nor the culture has a perfect response to. And finally, the most private fear of all, the one that requires the most careful handling in the fiction and the lore, the fear that the specific person who went into the transformation, the child, the aspirant, the young man from whatever world who had a particular face and a particular voice and particular things he found funny and a particular way of standing when he was nervous, is not the same person who came out the other side wearing the armor. This fear cannot be fully addressed, because the answer to it is complicated in ways that the culture does not have the vocabulary to handle. The transformation is profound. Something is genuinely different after it. The question of whether enough continuity exists between who the aspirant was and who the warrior became for them to be understood as the same person, in the way that philosophers understand identity as continuity, is not one that the Imperium's theology or the chapter's training were designed to answer. Whilst the best answer available is probably the same one that applies to any version of this question that humans ask about themselves. Identity is not a fixed thing that survives or does not survive change. It is the thread of continuity through change, the pattern that persists even as the specific contents vary. A Space Marine is not the same person he was before the transformation. He is also not a different person in any meaningful sense. He is the continuation of that person through the most drastic change that any person can undergo while still being recognizably themselves. Whether that answer is satisfying depends heavily on what you brought to the question. A closing thought: the gift in the fear. All of the fears we have discussed today, from the grandiose and cosmic to the small and private, share a quality that I want to name before we close. Every one of them is the evidence of genuine attachment. You cannot fear losing something unless you actually value it. You cannot fear failing something unless you actually care about it. The fears that remain in a Space Marine, after everything the transformation could remove has been removed, are the catalogue of what actually matters to them. What the conditioning could not erase, because the conditioning cannot erase things that are genuinely fundamental, rather than simply biologically convenient. The corruption fear proves that their loyalty is real. The gene seed fear proves that their investment in the chapter's future is genuine. But the Blood Angel's flaw proves that their identity as sons of Sanguinius is not simply a label, but a living thing they would choose to preserve if given the choice. The Space Wolves' Wolfen fear proves that their brotherhood is the specific thing they cannot afford to lose. The fear of the Tyranids proves that they understand scale and are not comfortable with the mathematics of the universe, even when they cannot let that discomfort stop them. The fear of the Necrons proves that they understand the cost of certain choices and have considered what they have chosen. The fear of the Chaos Space Marines proves that their goodness, however that word applies to beings this formidable, is chosen rather than simply installed. They know no fear, the Emperor said. He built them to serve something larger than any of them, and in a war that cannot be won in any final sense, on behalf of a species that does not always deserve its defenders. He took human beings and made them into something transhuman, and in doing so, he removed most of what made fear the ordinary human constant. What remained, in the gaps between everything that was removed, was a more interesting thing than simple fearlessness. What remained was the specific fears of beings who have decided what they love: the chapter, the gene seed, the brotherhood, the mission, the memory of what they were, and the possibility of what they might yet be, and who face the universe with those loves intact. They know no fear, but they know all the fears worth having, and they choose to face them anyway. That is what it means to be a Space Marine. Thus the galaxy bleeds, why the present moment makes every fear sharper. There is one final dimension to this question of what Space Marines fear that we have not yet addressed, and it is the dimension that makes all the other fears more immediate, more urgently relevant than they might have been at any earlier point in the long history of the 41st millennium. The Great Rift has opened. Known in Imperial records as the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Scar in reality, the wound across the sky, it is an enormous tear in the fabric of real space that stretches across a significant portion of the galaxy, bisecting it in a way that has transformed everything about how the Imperium functions and how every war it fights is conducted. Warp storms on a scale not seen since the Age of Strife rage along its edges, while making entire sectors inaccessible or traversable only at enormous risk. Communication between the two halves of the galaxy that the rift has divided is severely compromised. The psychic pressure it generates has awakened latent gifts in humans who had no previous indication of such capabilities, flooding the Imperium's population with unsanctioned psychers who cannot be easily managed. For Space Marines specifically, the Great Rift has amplified every fear on this list. The corruption fear is more acute because the rift has brought the warp closer to the material universe everywhere, not just in the places where chaos cults or demonic incursions previously required significant preparation. Demons manifest with less ritual scaffolding than before, and the subtle influence of the ruinous powers reaches further and more easily into the minds of anyone with any psychic sensitivity. The conditions that chaos requires to work its long and patient corruption are now ambient rather than exceptional. The gene seed fear is more acute because the rift has disrupted the supply lines and communication channels that allow chapters to tithe their genetic material to Mars, to receive monitoring results, to access the archived samples that serve as insurance against catastrophic loss. Chapters in what has been called the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy that the rift has cut off from Terra, have been essentially on their own for extended periods, unable to confirm the genetic health of their lineages, are unable to access external support if something begins going wrong in the biological machinery that sustains them. The Tyrannid fear is more acute because multiple hive fleets have taken advantage of the chaos the rift created, pressing advances in areas where Imperial defenses have been stretched beyond their designed limits to cover the new threats that the rift brings. The shadow in the warp now competes with the psychic noise of the rift itself for primacy in the consciousness of any Imperial psyker, creating conditions where the specific warning signs of an approaching hive fleet become harder to distinguish from the background roar of a wounded galaxy. And the institutional fear, the fear that the war is going badly, that the scale of the challenges exceeds the capacity of what exists to meet them, is more acute than it has been at any prior point in the long history of the Adeptus Astartes. Because the Great Rift represents a qualitative change rather than simply a quantitative one, it is not just more of what the Imperium has always faced. It is a fundamentally different condition, a galaxy in which the laws that previously governed the boundary between reality and the warp have been significantly loosened, in which the long, slow deterioration that chaos has engineered across 10,000 years has achieved a landmark. The Primarch Robuta Guilliman has returned. His resurrection through the combined efforts of Belisarius Cawl and the Aeldari is not a small thing. A being of genuinely superhuman administrative and tactical capability. The Primarch whose Codex Astartes shaped the entire Adeptus Astartes for 10 millennia now walks among his sons again. The Indomitus crusade that he led in the immediate aftermath of his resurrection reclaimed territory and reinforced chapters across dozens of sectors. The Ultima founding that he oversaw created new chapters and strengthened old ones with Primaris Space Marine warriors whose genetic integrity and physical capabilities exceed the previous Astartes generation in several measurable respects. But Guilliman's return is also a reminder of the scale of what was lost and what has changed in his absence. One Primarch, walking, out of the 20 who once led the original legions. One. And the words he has spoken upon seeing the Imperium that emerged from his long sleep have been described as devastating. The response of a man who built something with a specific vision, and now confronts what 10,000 years of fear and war and corruption and institutional drift have made of that vision. He chose to serve it anyway, because despair is not an option that the son of the Emperor allows himself when the alternative is fighting. The Space Marines who serve under him, or who serve in chapters he reinforced, or who simply know that he exists and walks among them, they carry an awareness that the stakes are as high as they have been since the Siege of Terra. That what they do in this particular period will shape whether the Imperium enters a new era or follows the civilizations that preceded it into extinction and myth. While this is not a comfortable awareness, but it is the awareness that the angels of death carry into every engagement in the era Indomitus, and it adds its particular weight to every other fear we have discussed today. The corruption fear, and the gene seed fear, and the flaw and the wolfen, and the approaching tide of the hive fleets, and the cold patience of awakening tomb worlds, and the dark mirror of the traitor legions, and the institutional reckoning with scale. The galaxy is bleeding, and the Space Marines, who know no fear in the conventional sense, face the bleeding galaxy with the full catalogue of fears that prove their devotion is real, that their brotherhood is genuine, that their values are not merely programmed, but chosen in whatever sense that word applies to beings whose choices are shaped by augmentation and conditioning, but not wholly determined by them. They face it because there is no one else who can. They face it with their fears intact, and they face it as they have always faced it, without retreating. The Emperor protects, and the Space Marines, Whatever they fear, protect as well.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.